It's great to have you with us for another episode of Marking the Times. I always appreciate you all joining me every week. It's exciting for me to be able to be with you and answer questions you send in, but also talk about events related to Bible prophecy. Again, you can send in questions not related to prophecy as well to our Facebook page, and I'll try to get around to answer some of those as soon as I can. But this is such a historic week, I just can't resist talking about a little bit more about these Abraham Accords that were signed this week. President Trump was there. This takes place in Washington, D.C., where you have Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel there with representatives from the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain signing these peace treaties, this normalization of relations between these nations. It really is historic. It's certainly historic politically. It's historic diplomatically. Boaz Bismuth, in an article in the Times of Israel, said this is the event that will change the history of the Middle East. I think that's not an overstatement for that to be made. Back in 1979, Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel. In 1995, Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel. And here we are now, 25 years later, with these so-called Abraham Accords. And this is the first time that two nations signed peace treaties on the same day. So it is truly historic politically, it's historic diplomatically and culturally. But I think it also is historic prophetically. We've alluded to this in some of our past episodes of Marking the Times when this was kind of announced that this was going to take place. But I want to dig in a little bit deeper today into Daniel 9:27, which is a passage that talks about a future peace in Israel. And I think this is a very relevant passage. This is kind of the entry point in Scripture to really talk about the significance of these peace treaties that have been made and Israel's future. Let me just read Daniel 9:24 to 27, or verse 27. This passage is about the 70th week of Daniel, or that final 7 years of history before the return of the Messiah. And it says in Daniel 9:27, and the he here, the antecedent to that is the coming prince. This coming world ruler that's been discussed in Daniel. He's in Daniel 7, verse 8, he's called the little horn. In Daniel chapter 11, he'll be called the prince who's to come. So it's he, this coming world ruler, will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. Now the many there is the many in Israel. And 1 week here is 1 week of 7 years, is 1 week of years or 7 years. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offerings. So implied here is that the making of this covenant will allow Israel to carry out sacrifice and grain offerings, which means they have to have a temple, which would be the third Jewish temple. So part of this covenant that's made is going to involve Israel having a guaranteed right to carry out their sacrifices there in a rebuilt temple on the Temple Mount. But one of the reasons I think this is significant is, it says, he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. So the event that starts the 7-year tribulation period is not the rapture. It's a treaty that this coming world ruler, the Antichrist or the little horn or the willful king, that he will make with the many in Israel for a period of 7 years. And it says he'll make a firm covenant with them. And the verb that's used here is from the Hebrew root gabar, which means to be strong or mighty. So it says here he'll make a firm covenant. Some will have here he makes a strong covenant. Some might even use the word he makes a compelled covenant. That is, he's going to compel the parties to do this. But it can also mean, this word can, to strengthen. So he will strengthen a covenant is the way some would translate this. So it could mean that he's going to confirm a covenant that would mean he either a covenant that's either an existing one or a new one. So what the implications of this are, I think, is these Abraham Accords could be the beginning of a lot of dominoes falling. It's believed that there may be 5 or 6 other Arab nations that are going to follow suit in these with what Bahrain and UAE have done. And so if you have a lot of these nations making these treaties with Israel, it could be that when the Antichrist, this world ruler, comes along, he will strengthen a covenant with the many for 1 week. In other words, it'll be in place, or at least the basics of it will be in place. He'll come along then and strengthen or make that covenant strong. Now, certainly it could be that he makes a new one. But with what we're seeing happening here, it can also be that he comes along and strengthens a covenant that already exists, or so he makes a strong or a firm covenant. So I think that's really significant in what we're seeing today. This could be the beginnings of some kind of covenant that the Antichrist then will come along at some point and strengthen or make stronger, which will begin the 7-year tribulation period. And of course, I believe that the rapture will take place before that. And obviously, there can be a lot of events that will take place after the rapture before this event takes place that starts the tribulation period. But hopefully that's a little bit more background on you for you on the significance of these Abraham Accords. And we'll keep watching this and try to keep you up to date and informed as time goes along. But anyway, thank you for joining us again. As always, God bless you. I hope you have a good week.